While some of its games have aged over the years, there's no question that when we talk about the PlayStation 1's library, we're looking at a sprawling list of legendary games. From Crash Bandicoot and Final Fantasy VII to Ridge Racer and Resident Evil, it's a deep library of classics that for many are still a blast to play today. But what about the games that never made it to stores? Games can get cancelled for any number of reasons. The budget could spiral out of control. Some games are canned because they spend too much time in development. If they get to development, that is. The PlayStation had thousands of games announced and released over its lifespan, but there's always the ones that didn't make it, and they're the ones that we're focusing on today. But before we get any further, hello viewers, it's good to see you. I'm Will from Cultured Vultures, and these are the cancelled PS1 games that we still want to play. If you want to see more from Cultured Vultures, why not slap that subscribe button, go and give it a good slap, and ring the bell while you're at it for good measure. And why not comment down below? Or don't, it's not really my problem. So we got 20 titles from Phoenix Games on the PS1, but no Titan AE. The planet is off its axis, just like the dudes who made this gimpy game. It has an actual gimp in it. Surely one of the most infamous cancelled games of all time. Thrill Kill drew attention early on for two reasons. Reason numero uno. Thrill Kill was touted to be the first 4-player fighting game on the PlayStation and promised to make Mortal Kombat look more like Spyro the Dragon in comparison. And reason numero 2. It featured some of the freakiest fighters you'd ever seen. 10 bizarre 90s edge fighters trapped in hell battling to the death. Not the worst premise for a fighter, but everything about Thrill Kill screamed brutality, including the fact that it was basically Power Stone for deviants. Maybe too much so. The original game was to receive an adults-only rating for graphic violence and sexual content, which would have effectively rendered the game unreleasable. Surely some people should just stick to a copy of Bazaar for this sort of fun. Toned-down version was due to be made, but it was cancelled by EA after it was acquired by Virgin Interactive. Who are the real virgins here? This controversial decision occurred just 2 weeks before Thrill Kill was due to be released. Gloomy 90s teens with a bloodlust for violence were devastated. But the developers of Paradox would reskin the game and release it in the form of Wu-Tang Shaolin style for the PS1. So it basically all worked out. And if you do want to experience the original title, you can easily do so with a few select words in a certain search engine. That's right, ask Jeeves. Ask him if he remembers this Tomb Raider knockoff while you're there. Promising to be a Tomb Raider killer with taglines like deeper than any tomb, Beneath was an odd project for Presto Studios, a company mostly known for developing point-and-click titles like Myst 3 Exile and their Journeyman Project franchise. Beneath would be published by Activision for the PS1 and PC. Players would take the role of Jack Wells, who was searching for his archaeologist father, and in order to find him would have to navigate an elaborate series of underground tunnels leading to a plethora of fantastic worlds. Taking inspiration from the likes of H.G. Wells and Jules Verne, Beneath had ambition to spare. Jack would discover 3 distinct societies living underground in a fully functioning world to explore. And as players explored the underground universe across 12 levels, they would uncover vast technologies and secrets about what really happened to this world. This sounds great, but Presto Studios really struggled to develop for different genres. It would seem that generally they were just stuck in their lane. This project chugged along for a few years, only to be cancelled in 2002 after the company went out of business. Commando, which has nothing to do with the Arnie classic, would have been an exciting third-person shooter on PS1, if everything had gone to plan. The game would have taken place on a variety of locations on Mars, battling enemies and taking on bosses at the end of each stage. That's a video game, alright. It even had menus. Fucking hell, move aside, Metal Gear Solid. Where Commando really became interesting was in the promise that the players would have to hack into enemy weapon systems and seize control before turning them on your enemies. It was a much more open-ended experience than many first-person shooters of the era, and it would be designed by Stefan De Luca and published by Namco through a deal with Virtual Studios. So what happened? Well, Virtual Studio pulled out when they realized the deal would have them as the sole financial partner. When they pulled funding, the project fell apart, and today we only have a few scant screenshots and a super short video to prove that Commando even existed in the first place. But then this next game did actually come out. Onimusha has the distinction of being the only game on this list that was eventually reborn on a different console. In this case, Onimusha was cancelled in its true PS1 form. only to be reworked and brought to market as the extremely popular PS2 release Onimusha Warlords. While we are glad the game ultimately came out, we do wonder what would have happened in the original PS1 release. It is believed that the PS1 version of Onimusha was around 50% completed before it was cancelled. Why was the game cancelled? We couldn't say, but given that the PS2 was on the horizon, it seemed probable that this game, which used the Resident Evil 2 engine, and whose plot and basic mechanics remained intact from one console to the next, was simply shifted to prioritize the upcoming PS2. But there's something about the super low poly look of Onimusha on the PS1 that's hard not to be charmed by. This wasn't the last time Capcom made a bold decision on a major release in the midstream. Did you know that Devil May Cry actually began life as Resident Evil 4? Yes, you did know that. Everyone knows that. But now you know it twice. Did you also know what happened to this little pig when it didn't go to market? It died. A quick glance at what little information and screenshots we have for PIG, or Pig, reveals a game that we would have loved to have played, if only because some publications somehow compared it to Tomb Raider. While it is believed that this Banjo-Kazooie-esque 3D platformer made it to some form of development, there's no build of the game that's available to play. What we do know about this less than notorious PIG, whose acronym spells out Private Investigator George, suggests a relatively standard platformer starring a pig named George. There would have been a range of challenging levels and environments, minigames, NPCs and more. And there was a lot of promise over its 3-year development cycle. Instead, Team 17 went in a different direction after the release of 1995's Worms. The success of that game led the team to putting more and more energy into its many sequels and spin-offs. There's dozens of Worms games available, but all we want is one little PIG. Hands off, Nicolas Cage! It's a shame that the original Powerslave for the PS1, Saturn and MS-DOS has largely been forgotten by time. It's a fun, visually striking first-person shooter set in an ancient Egyptian city near the end of the 20th century. Powerslave is surprisingly non-linear too, and while it isn't exactly an immersive sim, it has more ways of approaching challenges than most of its peers. The sequel Powerslave 2 was going in an all different direction. The game was going to take a third-person perspective, focusing on adventure elements and exploring the locales that would be set centuries before the events of the first game, meaning it wasn't even going to be a sequel. Good or bad, it would have been interesting, but nothing would come of it, as Crave Entertainment would acquire the company in 1998 and it was gone a year later. But it's not all bad news. In 2022, Powerslave was re-released as an enhanced port for PC and various consoles. It's worth exhuming for sure, especially if you're a fan of modern boomer shooters. No, this cancelled PS1 game has nothing to do with the forgotten World War II espionage game from EA that had booby DLC. Had Saboteur been released in 1993 or even 2000 as developer Tygon had intended, it's possible that it could have been a serious hit at the end of the PS1's lifespan. We do have some early video and other visuals to show us how much potential Saboteur had from a gameplay or even graphical standpoint. Saboteur would have seen players assume the role of a ninja named Shin in feudal Japan. Stealth would be emphasized in many combat situations, but developers Tygon insisted the game would not be simply going down a fighting game or adventure game route. It was seemingly their intention to create something that embraced a variety of styles and genres. The game would have provided plenty of action, as screenshots and video suggests, but also some perhaps unique gameplay elements not seen on the PS1. However, in all likelihood, it was precisely the fact that the PS2 was on the horizon that killed this game. It's not like today when the PS5 came out and the PS4 seemed to get supported, well, forever. Based on a 90s comic book that either sums up everything good or thoroughly obnoxious about the decade, a Gen 13 game made sense when it first went into production in 1996. The story of a group of superpowered teens on the run from government forces and other bad guys is obvious video game fodder, perfect for release on PS1, Saturn and PC. As is often the case, the game was seemingly a victim of its own goals, which led to a game that stayed in development for far too long, costing far too much money and eventually becoming an easy victim of cutbacks. EA wanted a game that could have the depth and detail of a Mario game with the action and brawling of Street Fighter and with the platforming shooter dynamics of Earthworm Jim. 25 stages were planned to cover a multitude of gameplay styles, but it was just too much for one game to shoulder. So it wasn't a surprise when the game was eventually canned and now the IP is deeply obscure. At least we have a pretty fascinating, extremely 1990s tech demo to show us what the game would have been. It would have been a pretty good game from a pretty forgotten IP too. Now wait a minute, you might be saying. Aeon Flux was released for the PlayStation 2 and Xbox in 2005. You're being silly, William. Stop it. It's not great, but it doesn't make my depression any worse to play it. That all may be true. Yet the 2005 licensed game based upon the pretty terrible Charlize Theron movie is not the only time someone tried to bring the MTV cult animated series to video games. It's just the only time it ever kind of worked out. And the 1996 effort to bring Aeon Flux to PS1 is another regrettable example of a game being cancelled due to forces beyond its control. And in the case of the unreleased 1996 Aeon Flux, the cancellation came because Viacom New Media merged with Virgin Interactive right in the middle of development. The game had already been promoted at E3 and had been advertised in some places, but every game in the pipeline from Viacom was cancelled due to the merger. It is interesting to see the bits of the game that were out there. An action platformer would have suited this universe nicely, but we do know what this game may have actually been like. Back in the late 90s, Cryo Interactive developed Pax Corpus, a game which no one remembers but is oh so Aeon Fluxy. You know, actually, Jim, I actually do remember Pax Corpus, and yeah, it's a pretty bad game. One day, I've always wanted to talk about it, so one day maybe we'll get back to Pax Corpus. One of the biggest box office bombs of the first decade of the 2000s was the pretty awesome animated film Titan AE. Its failure reverberated in all sorts of unfortunate ways.
Hi there, sorry, Jimmy, just cutting in here. I just realised that the Titan AE trailer had Creed as the soundtrack. How did we let this fail? How did this happen, guys? Can you take me higher? I'm gonna give you back to Will for the rest of this century.
One of these was the death of a licensed game that would have come to PS1, Dreamcast and PC, offering an action-adventure experience based around the epic plot of the sci-fi blockbuster directed by Don Bluth and Gary Goldman. Playing in either third person or from the cockpit of the spaceship, players would battle the dredge and search for the titular Titan AE. Nothing groundbreaking, of course, but it could have been a solid licensed game on the PS1. There was even the preview at E3 2000 with details on the gameplay and a notion that Blitz Games would have taken some liberties with adapting the movie's story to a video game. Ultimately, 20th Century Fox saw no reason to release a game for a movie that relatively few people wanted to see, especially so late in the PS1's life cycle. Today, the film is hardly remembered by many people except for a few dedicated fans, and either good or bad, it's safe to assume that the game would have suffered the same fate. There is a demo out there that you can play, and while it's absolutely no grab by the ghoulies, it could have been something kind of interesting. And those were the cancelled PS1 games that we all still want to play. I would love to get my hands on Titan AE, that film was awesome. But there were plenty of other cancelled games. How about some games that never came out that you wanted to play? Why not let us know in the comments? And while you're at it, why not like and subscribe? Smash that bell, go on, smash it with a big old hammer. I know you can do it. I believe in you.